Hello and welcome to this video. This video is going to be called When Did Jazz Die? I'm pretty sure jazz died at some point. What do I mean by die? I mean when the form no longer has any forward motion, that there is no more innovation going on, there is no more newness, it's just people replicating the same old stuff round and round, pushing certain aspects of it. It becomes like a museum piece or a tribute to itself. People get too enamored with the sort of ideology and dogma that surrounds it. It starts to become treated with reverential sort of respect, so that you can't move it or change it, you can't mess with it, you can't be avant-garde, you have to play it safe, you have to be traditional. Well, this happens to all art forms at a certain point. But with jazz, when did it happen? Well, a good place to start when it didn't happen would be 1959. 1959 can be seen as the high watermark of jazz. In terms of the commercial peak, we have to go back to the 1930s with artists like Glenn Miller and Artie Shaw and Benny Goodman. But as a form of music, a lot of the esoteric aspects of bebop, which had alienated a lot of people in terms of seeing this music as a popular music form, actually coalesced around certain artists. And in 1959, you had a whole host of albums that were proper heavy jazz albums, but by the same token were very, very successful either artistically or commercially. Those albums, of course, would be Kind of Blue by Miles Davis, which took the sort of language of bebop and then by mixing with a sort of modal approach and calming the whole thing down, he created an album which has gone on to be the biggest selling album in jazz history. Also that came out that year was Charlie Mingus, which was exploring a much more expressive aspects of jazz. You know, it's going back in history and yet looking forward at the same time. There's elements of the classic players on this album. I mean, Mingus Art On, which is the album in question in 1959, is two things at once. It looks forward to free jazz, but at the same token, it looks back at artists like Duke Ellington and Lester Young. And so it brings the two traditions together. In terms of really pushing jazz to the limits and creating something which was controversial, we have The Shape of Jazz to Come by Ornette Coleman. Also in 1959, we saw Dave Brubeck bringing that sort of West Coast sort of college jazz thing to the fore and actually having a hit record with Take 5. So in 1959, we know that jazz is alive and well. But in a funny way, that's the last hurrah. And there could be an argument that 1959 is the place where we could say it did die. Or if it didn't die, at least got a diagnosis of a terminal illness in 1959. But they didn't know, did they? At that point, jazz was riding high. And as the 1960s started up, you know, in terms of the Grammys were handing out, Grammy awards to people like Frank Sinatra and Ella Fitzgerald. You know, the commercial end of jazz was still there. You know, these whippersnapper, up and coming bands like the Beatles, and the Rolling Stones, they were seen as no threat to jazz. But by the mid-60s, people like Ella Fitzgerald and Wes Montgomery were trying to sell records by doing jazz versions of Beatles songs. And so rock music, not rock and roll, because rock and roll can be seen as the sort of troublesome child of jazz, but rock music does something else. And I think what happened in the 1960s is the record companies suddenly realized that there was even more money to be made, and little labels who had seen their business of selling great music, and tried to create a great product to sell to an audience, and were happy to support jazz musicians on their labels and maybe pull in 10,000 copies of an album and be able to, pay the bills and pay the musicians off and put a little bit in the bank. Suddenly the record companies were looking at bands which were selling millions and millions. And these bands had far less overheads. You didn't have to pay for orchestras or arrangers or specialist engineers. These records could come out of places like Sun Records, they could just come out of the middle of nowhere, a few mics thrown up and a raw sound, bit of spring reverb here and there, and suddenly you have a hit record. You don't need to pay session musicians. You have to, the costs come down, and yet the profits are so huge. And of course, I really see the death knell of jazz being rung by the Beatles. The rock musicians that emerge in the 1960s are definitely anti-jazz. There starts to be a thought amongst the rock and rollers that jazz is for the elites and it's for the generation before. It's your dad's music, not our music. And so up until 1959, we can see jazz as being cool. We can see jazz as being something that you would want to, maybe rebel to, or state your identity to. And that all goes in the 1960s. And jazz's reaction is to move towards free jazz. Now, I am a huge fan of free jazz, and I find it very exciting. And I like the fact that jazz musicians were pushing the established ideas to such a limit. Musicians like John Coltrane and Ornette Coleman, then later on Archie Shepp, Albert Ayler, and then in Europe, people like Peter Brotzmann, are really buying into a countercultural approach to music, which is very, very interesting. For me, free jazz is the last true creative gasp of jazz. And I think we have to look at how free jazz, which in the end was almost like the logical, elusive limit of jazz history. How many people actually liked free jazz? I'm a big fan of free jazz, but do I really enjoy the albums when I put them on? Sometimes yes, a lot of the time no. These are difficult albums to get your head round, Not only do they not have any semblance of rhythm or pitch or melody, sometimes they do not even have the semblance of arrangement or dynamics even. Free jazz seems to split into all sorts of different areas. There's sort of a chamber jazz, which is easier to understand, but it's quite cold. There is the civil rights, black emancipation music that really explores the primal scream that had lay within black culture in America and black music all the way through it, with artists like Albert Ayler and Archie Shepp, very political. So there's all sorts of different wings of jazz. John Coltrane is exploring free music to almost like free the soul. And so there's a wide range there in the music of free jazz. But by the end of the 60s, although there's a certain crossover into the burgeoning drug culture that's emerging, people who are dropping acid and listening to Jefferson Airplane and Grateful Dead can be taken even further out by purchasing a copy of, say, Om by John Coltrane. And Om as an album is almost like marketed towards that audience. People like Miles Davis spot this and they make a shift over to music which the establishment no longer want to call jazz. Everyone's very upset when Miles starts to use straight rock beats, electric instruments, stops having sort of jazz arrangements of heads and then solos, using electronics. The album covers start to change. There's a great big pushback, and we forget how much of a pushback there was. That Miles Davis in 1969, when he made Bitches Brew, was seen to have sold out. And so the jazz establishment at that point start to question the validity of this music in quite a snotty and snobby way. It could be argued that jazz begins to die, or the death knell really is sounded, is rung, in 1969 with Bitches Brew. Bitches Brew is a really interesting album. In terms of rock music, it's some of the most advanced rock music ever recorded. It's fully out there, made by an absolute master, the sort of musician that doesn't exist in rock music. Miles Davis had a history and a lineage that was so deep and far-reaching, and yet he was bringing that to the music of Jimi Hendrix, bringing that to the music of Sly Stone, but creating something that, for me, has the same weight and artistic coherence and expressiveness that jazz has when it's at its best. The soloists are playing a sort of bastardized version of free jazz, but bringing it to bear along straight rock beats. It becomes hypnotic. It's about otherness. He is hiring in young musicians. Those young musicians, as much as having one foot in the history of jazz, are also have one foot in the countercultural movement. And people like Tony Williams form bands like Tony Williams' lifetime, and in that band we still hear the pulse and the swing, we still hear the heavy improvisation, but he titles his albums things like Turn It Over because he wants to turn over society. Jazz has become revolutionary at this point, but he's also losing its grip in terms of its cultural relevance, and I think this is actually what happens at the end of the 60s. There's an aspect of jazz which is very forward thinking, but by opening that door, you are going to shut the door on jazz itself. This is the point where jazz eats itself. And by the time we get to the early 70s, jazz is actually having a boom, which is equivalent to the boom of swing jazz in the 1930s. Bands like the Mavish Nocturne and then with Turns Forever and Weather Report pioneer an instrumental form of music which has the expressiveness of jazz, but also is able to push units out there, following in the footsteps of Bitches Brew, which sell some records. It's a very impressive thing. Again, as the decade moves on, the virtuosity of these musicians and the influence of jazz on soul and funk starts to become apparent. And for many musicians, it's very easy, if they've worked in the sort of jazz end of the market, especially the sort of jazz soul end of the market, to move straight over to jazz. And we see a lot of straight jazz musicians. A brilliant example of this would be Herbie Mann, that actually starts out in quite a creative realm in the sort of third stream movement that come out of Los Angeles in the 1950s. And then he moves towards something which is very funky and very commercial. Jazz musicians could do it, and they start to sell records. And then the record companies start to say, look, we don't really want you to play this heavy fusion or this free jazz. Can you not try and have a disco hit? And disco comes in and sort of eats jazz. Disco could be seen as the anathema to prog, but in terms of jazz, it's like the right at the bottom, right underneath all that rhythm and blues, all that rock and roll, all that doo-wop, all right underneath. I mean, disco comes straight out of jazz, but it's a simplification of what jazz did that goes way beyond what any swing band had done. And so disco's emergence in 76, 77 could also be seen as the big nail in the coffin of jazz, as the jazz musicians who still had the record deals were trying to have hit records. Some did brilliant music, like Herbie Hancock's Chameleon, but would your jazz fan class that as jazz? And what do the people do that don't want to go that route? Well, in the 70s, they go underground. And the consensus is that what musicians who are still playing jazz through the 70s on these tiny little labels and in these clubs, what they are doing is keeping jazz alive, right? So in the 70s, we can see that jazz is suffering and people are trying to keep it alive. And at this point, how do you keep it alive? Well, you play in the tradition, and this idea of tradition emerges. You've got to understand the jazz musicians that were playing in the 1960s did not care about tradition. By the 1970s, traditions become a very important thing. These musicians are seen as being from the epoch before rock and roll. Suddenly, a figure like Duke Ellington is a legend. He's going back to a time which people weren't born in. And very soon, in 1974, Duke Ellington passes away, and we start to see the greats slowly pass away through the 70s into the 80s. Musicians turn, the musicians take it over. Bands that, like the Count Basie band, Glenn Miller band, where the original members have died a long time ago, get taken over usually by a relative or somebody who can prove some sort of lineage to it. And before you know it, you have this sort of almost like tribute to itself as these bands go around playing incredible music, incredible arrangements, but it's nostalgia. Jazz becomes the music of nostalgia. In 1970, there's this huge rock and roll boom, and the beginnings of rock music. Rock and roll suddenly becomes a nostalgia. We get TV series like Happy Days. We get films like Grease. Here in the UK, we had bands emerge like the Darts and Shawaddy Waddy. Rock and roll, which had come out of rhythm and blues, is suddenly made very, very safe. And we see it moving from being sort of a rebellious music to actually the music of people's childhoods, the music of children. I loved rock and roll in 1977 when I was 9 years old. I was a massive big fan of the Fonz, right? Jazz will be seen at that time as even more archaic than the rock and roll is. An interesting thing happens towards the end of the 70s. A lot of the sort of stellar fusion musicians like John McLaughlin, Chick Corea, Herbie Hancock, they turn back to standard jazz, the jazz that had gone before. The electric instruments suddenly go. Suddenly they're wearing tuxedos. Herbie Hancock sat behind a grand piano. The album that Herbie Hancock makes, called VSOP, the first one, has one album's worth of his Headhunters funk band, and then another album which is basically the 60s quintet he was in with Miles Davis, with Freddie Hubbard replacing that. That album, I think, where they look back, I think that is interesting. It's a certain point when the fusion musicians look back, they start to play, like Chick Corea's Griffith Park collection. John McLaughlin's, puts away the electric guitar and turns back to acoustic guitar. And by the end of the 80s, he's playing something which is much closer to straight jazz than he was before. The music's tempered, the music's tamed. The disco jazz thing that happened in the 70s by the 1980s turns into Fuzak, and FM radio starts up, and we have superstars like Kenny G suddenly coming out and selling 60 million records. The jazz world, or even the fusion world, is not even going to accept Kenny G as being part of it, which I think is a shame, because he's a damn good saxophone player. Yes, he makes very, very commercial music, but in any other music form, you would expect to have somebody there. There is always the nickel back to the Napalm Death. We have to remember this. And so we could see by the early 80s, jazz has at that point turned into a little bit of a museum piece. Now, a lot of this has to do with funding as well. In America, the arts funding in the 1960s was for avant-garde art. Which meant people who was experimenting, people who were pushing the form forward. But by the 1980s, with the Reagan government coming in and much more conservatism coming into the music, we see the funding structure changing, and suddenly the funding structure is to fund America's great art forms. And there's an argument made that jazz is America's great art form. Of course, it's probably cinema that is America's great art form, with jazz following second fiddle, as it were. Also, this idea that jazz is the great American art form belies the fact that by the early 30s or even the late 20s, jazz had escaped the United States of America, and great jazz groups were emerging all over the world. It had reached out and was doing all sorts of incredible things. By the 1980s, that starts to get ignored, and we have the sort of tradition of jazz. The funding structure exists for people to get funding to run orchestras, which are a great way of funding music, because there's a structure to it. Wynton Marsalis emerges and becomes a figurehead of this new conservative jazz movement, and eventually becomes the man behind jazz at the Lincoln Center. And what we have there are sort of what seemed to me hyper-privileged musicians coming in and learning the tradition of jazz and learning how to respect jazz. The funding comes in because A, it makes an argument that jazz is the great American art form, B, that is related to race politics and the civil rights movement, and C, there is a worthiness of bringing those two things together. So I would be arguing that there is a moment in the 1980s where jazz is seriously under threat, but is actually, again, kept alive by the Wynton Marsalises who are suddenly selling lots and lots of records. Here in the UK, we have a very similar boom, really figureheaded by Courtney Pine, but then followed in by the likes of Tommy Smith and Andy Shepherd. Courtney Pine's take on jazz respected the tradition, but was a lot more open to other forms of music coming in. And here is the problem. If a music is going to stay alive, the way it stays alive is by changing. And there gets a point where, especially with a music form like jazz, that actually begat so many music forms, right? That at a certain point where the music forms that jazz has created eats jazz, all right? I believe that if we look at the spirit of jazz and what jazz did fundamentally, which I believe was push groove, swing, rhythm to the fore, a certain type of rhythm, which wasn't to do with being fast or even syncopated, which was to do with having a certain groove that makes your head nod, a certain weight, a certain visceral energy. And so that is an aspect of jazz that is now been taken up by all sorts of different music forms: reggae, funk, soul. The development of the individual voice, the fact that you want to buy a record because it's got Ella Fitzgerald singing on it, and you like Ella Fitzgerald's voice or Frank Sinatra's voice. With the advent of Bob Dylan, he takes that idea and maxes it out even more. And with Dylan, he makes the idea of the song very important. Now the song isn't just a triviality, a very sophisticated triviality, but in the music of Cole Porter and George Gershwin, it is about love. It's about silly things. It's musical numbers that you would tell a story. By the time Dylan comes in, there's a political weight to the songwriting, which has never been there before, really, in mainstream popular music. And also the uses of improvisation. By the 70s, bands like Led Zeppelin, they go around and playing a type of music that goes somewhere between the blues and a little bit of free improvisation to create sort of a psychedelic experience. So I see the spirit that exists in jazz then transfers into, in the 1970s, at that point, that VSOP point, that cultural point, emerges rap and hip hop. And rap and hip hop almost like take the mantle of jazz and move it on. And for a long time throughout the 80s and the 90s, there is a relationship, a direct relationship between jazz and hip hop. And there's a spirit that runs through the two. But of course, jazz has got to a point in its history where it can't accommodate for hip hop or rap. It can't say, yes, this is the new form of jazz, even though freestyle rappers rapping over a groove, and usually from a sample of what went before from the jazz world, for me, is out and out jazz. But now, at this point, even hip hop has atrophied and become it's eating itself. The early 90s emerged a whole ton of bands. Were just up the road from here. And one of those bands was Pop Will Eat Itself. It was well named because by the time we get to the 90s, pop itself is eating itself. And pop music changes and we get the advent of dance music, electronic music, the door. And now jazz is an anachronism. I would say by the end of the 90s, jazz is well and truly dead. And it's been dead for a while, right? It's turned into a museum piece. So what is the last hurrah for real jazz? Well, I think for me, interestingly, the last hurrah for real jazz comes from Ornette Coleman's group, Prime Time. Ornette Coleman's style of playing had influenced so many musicians in the 1980s who were like massively selling jazz artists. John Scofield and Pat Metheny come to mind. And Ornette Coleman had taken his harmonic approach and put it into a extremely creative fusion group called Prime Time. And for me, the way they were playing was so challenging to the mainstream. And once we were in this sort of conservative Wynton Marsalis world, nobody knew what to make of Ornette Coleman and his incredibly democratic approaches to improvisation, swing, and the techniques and methodologies of jazz. I remember reading an interview with Wynton Marsalis where he said people had misunderstood what Ornette was about. Because we have to remember his father, Ellis Marsalis, for all his reputation of being a conservative jazz teacher, was a huge fan and supporter of Ornette Coleman. Ornette Coleman's approach is key. I believe if we were to resuscitate jazz in a Frankenstein-style way, what we would have to do is really look at the achievements aesthetically of Ornette Coleman and bring those to young musicians in a way where they do not get put off by the tradition or the sort of show jumping jumps that have been put in front of them that they feel they have to jump over to prove that they are great players. There's a democratization with Ornette Coleman. And of course, where does that influence come from? And where does it go? Well, it comes from Ornette's love of bebop, but his want to be able to express himself within the chord changes. Where does it go? It goes on to the idea that creativity comes from improvisation, and that anything goes. When hip hop emerges, it starts to do a thing. It attempts to do. It does attempt. It does do it. It does something from a methodological point of view. Oh, I've got to myself. See, I'm trying here, and I've tripped myself up. I've done it all right for the first 25 minutes, and when we get to Ornette Coleman, I can't get my words out. I can't quite express myself. And in my stuttering, is there some sort of art in that? Does that actually work in the terms of this video as we get right to the end? And I'm trying to get and nail the final bit where you'll hopefully go, yeah, Andy might have a point, or I don't agree, or whatever it is. How do we get to that point? And my point here is it's coming from Ornette Coleman. And my point is, if we look at hip hop and we look at the way that they will take a chord progression from here, a beat from here, they will just slam those two together, and they won't care about whether these harmonically work, because there's just other aspects in which it does work, in its relation to the words, in its relation to the rhythm, in its relation to the context of what's going on. These little haphazard happenings, which Ornette Coleman seems so fascinated with. You know, when he brought his son Donato Coleman in at like 9 years old, who couldn't play drums, and he would bang away in sort of real amateur ecstasy upon the drums, created something which for Ornette was infinitely interesting in its novelty. I don't want jazz to die. When I do a title like this, I know that it is it creates a stink. I know that the jazz, you know, the jazz fans and jazz musicians will watch this and go, why is Andy saying this for? Why is he saying jazz is dead? I'm saying jazz is dead because it's my worry that it is. A couple of hours ago, I had a jazz musician from America turn up, BD Lenz. He's come over to the UK, turned up my studio. I pulled in a bass player. We never played before. We sat down, we played. It was an incredible experience. I've just been sat here mixing the stuff on my computer, which is why I'm sat here now talking to you. And this idea came in as I was listening to some of the takes. I'm trying to do something creative with jazz here. I'm trying to bring musicians into the room and get them to play without any preconceptions whatsoever. I'm leaving all the mistakes in. I'm leaving the conversation in. We have a conversation too, and you see how the conversation drives the music. Things come up and we react to it. And so why don't we play this? Why don't we play that? You know. The spectre of the jazz standard came in because we were playing a lot of high-powered fusion stuff. And so we went and played the most sort of cheesy jazz standard there is, Girl from Ipanema, which was an incredible contrast. Jazz is still something which is enjoyable, great to play, that I love very much, that I can listen to. There's still jazz musicians expressing themselves. But is it still alive? Right? Or is it dormant? Have have those people who want to wrap it up in cotton wool and stick it into a museum drawer and let it sit there, never to be touched again. Have they come along with their chloroform and clutched it over the mouth of jazz and put it asleep? And now they can sit there as asleep, playing, you know, through their jazz standards, or doing their sort of hip hop jazz crossover, whatever it is. That sounds to me so cliched. And what sounds cliched about it is the fact that there's no fight anymore. There's no tension. There's no incompetence. There's no not knowing what you're doing. Everything's too considered. I've tried to put my money where my mouth is. And that's why I think I'm doing this video now. Right? When did jazz die? It never did die. What happened? It was put to sleep, but it can come back, because the idea that there's going to be funky swinging music where people just make it up on the spot to have fun with and express themselves and improvise, wherever musicians want to do that, and they always will, there will be jazz. Jazz is not dead, right? It doesn't even smell funny, right? It's dormant. It's dormant like some astronaut on some intergalactic spaceship, you know, sat in their little, you know, digital coffin waiting to be woken up in 100 years when they arrived at their destination. Is that where all the true jazz musicians are? Asleep? Are they dormant? Are they awakening? Well, it could be time to awake, because I believe that the digital social networks, YouTube and all these things, they allow a place for musicians to stand up and tell their stories. I've gone from being a musician who plays the drums to essentially a storyteller. And that's the story I'm telling you. I've just told you a certain story or aspect of jazz, which I hope you found enjoyable. And I know my contentious titles brought you here, but what I want to say at the end of this video, and I really feel this is so important: jazz musicians, stop making albums. Stop trying to do the old model. It doesn't work for you because you're not commercially viable enough. What you do is esoteric, but it's needed. Get in the room and play and document it, and stop trying to make it perfect. Stop trying to think of it in some sort of pop music producer realm. Just get up and play. Play and play. Don't be ashamed. Don't be ashamed to get up and do it wrong. Stop worrying about whether you're playing the chord changes or the right phrases or your tones right. You know, let yourself off the leash. Let yourself go to something where you can explore who you are. And when you hear it and it sounds like there is a level of incompetence there that you want to cover up, do not cover it up, because it's that will bring jazz alive. It's the fact of being able to say musically, I don't know where we're going, but we're going, right? So everybody, I'm saying this to all the musicians out there, play. And if you only know your pentatonic scales, if you only know the blues, play the blues, because the blues is jazz and jazz is the blues. Express yourself. Find a way of making the music come out. Because if we're not, jazz, which is now currently realizing, you know, like Walt Disney's head, you know, on the shelf somewhere waiting to be reanimated when the technology, I don't know if this is true or not, but I believe that was a thing, was it not? Is next to Walt Disney's head, you know, which is probably shaking itself in disbelief as it looks at the state jazz, Disney is in now. And then the spirit of jazz's head is also chopped off, waiting to be reanimated. He's looking at all these very well-off college kids where they're well-off parents coming in and playing music that was being played years and years ago. What would Miles Davis say? You know, what did Keith Jarrett say about Miles Davis? He said that Miles would rather have a bad band playing bad music than the band that played the music he played before, right? Jazz is a form that has to be alive. So if we're going to reanimate that head, what we need to do is we need to come out and be true to ourselves, right? And hopefully there is life in the old dog yet, because deep down, I believe that the spirit of jazz, the spirit of musicians in the room communicating with each other, not worrying about compositions or cliches or anything that's gone before. Musicians will always want to do that. They'll always want to jam, right? And whilst musicians want to jam, the spirit of jazz will be there. So the jazz world needs to stop beating these people up. It needs to let these people in. Stop patronising them. Stop telling them that they got to earn their dues. There's no dues to be earned anymore, because there's no jazz world left to pay your dues into, right? And musicians, play, improvise, learn to find your own voice. Your own voice is rooted in your own foibles and your own Achilles heels, your own inabilities to do stuff as much as your abilities to do stuff. Let's democratize the music again, and let's look at this new technology we have, which is so great at telling the story of jazz, which I've learnt here on this channel. I think I've said my bit. I'm happy with this video. I've got to the end. If you liked it, put a like on it. If you want to see some more, subscribe. I have a Patreon down below. You can become a free or paid up member. And I have a PayPal tip jar that you can put a little bit of a PayPal tip into financially. Thank you very much. See you on the next video.